Who would win? A single warrior or 310 stronger warriors? This is Civilization 6, a game where you build a civilization to stand the test of time by expertly juggling your economic, diplomatic, and militaristic development. And while every game serves as a chance for you to improve those skills, the same can't be said for the AI, whose performance-enhancing chromosome is only supplemented by massive bonuses with each difficulty spike. This serves to make the late game similar after your superior Homo sapien brain inevitably evolves your status of sexual prey to sexual predator, with the real challenge coming early on when the deity AI will have a decisive advantage through free early technologies, an increase in unit strength, and a larger quantity of units, making it almost impossible to beat any deity opponent in a one-on-one. Although in this case, it's more like a 1-on-61 because every time I meet a nation, I have to declare war on them. But how did we even get into this situation? Well, meet a Minotaur. Ever since she was a little girl, she has only ever desired one thing: to make it to the stars. Unfortunately, like any other woman back in the pre-industrial age, she was married off at the ripe old age of 3 months till birth, before the marriage was consummated 2 months later, with the man who would become king of the Nubians. This was her reality until things took a turn for the worst after her husband died without an heir, forcing her to take the throne. From there, she was forced to play the game of geopolitics with Uno cards at the poker table, as no one wants to see a fat woman of color on top. That's what killed the king. And so when she finally took the throne and started talking about her ideas and dreams that didn't include the greatest sandwich to ever grace this mortal realm, well, that was all the justification anyone needed to claim the Nubian throne. And so against a world united that is individually stronger, on a difficulty that only 7% of players have ever beaten, can a Minotaur achieve her dream or be doomed to the fate of a Roman triumph? A Minotaur's chiefdom possessed plentiful food thanks to the abundant waters of the Nile, leaving it able to support an enormous population. It was a terrible place to found an empire. Without any stones or hills, their capacity to build troops or develop districts was equivalent to skid rows if Escobar paraded through like Mansa Musa on the Hajj. While normally this would be nothing more than a minor inconvenience, today it would prove to be a minor inconvenience, because a Minotaur was on a time limit. Every other nation began the game with 5 free technologies, meaning there was only a limited time until they would obtain walls, swordsmen, and horsemen, making victory impossible. But not because of any threats of being conquered, more so because Nubia would be unable to conquer them. You see, normally early conquest on deity goes much the same way as a pride parade in Saudi Arabia. Your entourage will be surrounded and beaten to death by hammers while bearded men stone you during your hasty retreat. Instead, it's wise to begin by building settlers to claim lands uninhabited by natives who can fight back. However, this wasn't an option for a Minotaur. Not only was there no land to settle in the middle of the Sahara, but because of the Great Sandwich War, Nubia won't be able to send out a settler due to the near certainty of its enslavement. No, the only hope a Minotaur has to survive long enough for space exploration is by conquering foreign lands, as Nubia prepares to go on the offensive. Offensive against who? Well, the time limit meant that she couldn't afford to be picky, as the closest neighbor, whether she liked it or not, would have to be the first target. And a Minotaur did not like what she saw. Cleopatra, queen of Egypt in the streets, and everybody's queen in the sheets. Her skill of seducing entire senates comes second only to billionaires with wallets fat enough to classify as poly. And unless bathwater is a required component for spacecraft, is the worst possible enemy out of 62 a Minotaur could ask for. For the Egyptians had mastered the chariot, and their elite Tamarianu were the strongest unit on the field until the medieval era. If she was able to muster even a single chariot, a Minotaur's dream would be over before it even began. So naturally, a Minotaur was posed with the question, how was she going to conquer Egypt before she could get walls or her vaunted archers? The answer was simple: she couldn't. Without discovering the bowstring and approximately 840 40 pieces of gold at this very moment, conquering Egypt would prove impossible.
Good evening, my melanated fellow.
Why are you wearing that?
I'm a convicted felon, was shot, have 5 kids with 3 baby mamas. I'm blacker than Obama, and I heard a real nigga needed dough. 3 archers for 2K gold by turn 100.
With her new rented army in tow, it was time for Nubia to launch the offensive that would change history forever. Egyptian forces met the invaders near the White Sahara as Nubian archers wasted no time engaging the enemy, with their stronger bowstrings and melanated skin tone making them perfectly suited to Sahara warfare. The forces of Amenetor held a tactical advantage in the battle that broke the combat virginity for both armies. And like a bottle of olive oil, when I come upon it, there was nothing left virgin about her warriors by the time the Patatis were done. Unfortunately, the rest of the war wouldn't be that easy. The warrior, thinking the battle was over, pushed in too deep and got himself surrounded. This was a pivotal moment in the war as the archers couldn't actually take the city. They needed a melee unit to engage the house-to-house combat urban warfare would entail, and the Nubians only had one. Realizing the impending disaster, Amenetor put the full power of the Patati on display as the warrior was just barely broken out of its encirclement, causing the Egyptian forces, who were now losing decisively, to retreat behind a defensive river line. A fortification that would be all too easy to protect from frontal assaults, but also a tactical blunder. Patati archers are historically better trained in hand-to-hand combat, and while they would never be able to defeat a designated melee unit, they would be able to hold their own. And so Amenetor ordered her forces into melee range using the river as protection before letting loose a flurry of arrows that inflicted heavy casualties on the Egyptian side. The Egyptian army, seeing the situation, expeditiously launched a counterattack of their own, focusing fire on a single unit of archers who was decimated. Losing a single archer would prove disastrous, as only 2 would be nowhere near enough to capture a city as prosperous as Rakote. But ranged warfare is where Amenetor excelled, training her troops in the way of the arrow rigorously and thus giving them more experience for faster promotions. But despite the recovery, the unit is still in grave danger, as after the first combat of the day, the second may just be the final nail in the coffin. And in the end, it turns out Patatis are both different animals and the same beast. This heroic display both rallied the troops and demoralized the enemy to the point where you'd be forgiven for thinking Cleo's army was led by Chairman Mao, with how hard we had them bouncing on Zedong, as the siege of Rakote had now begun. Back at camp, Amenetor got a surprising report from one of her scouts. An unprotected civilian was seen fleeing outside Egyptian walls, a war crime Amenetor just couldn't pass up. And so units were ordered to surround the city, capturing the settler in the process. That was the plan, at least, until news came from back home. Terrible news. Menelik had made his appearance. This was bad, but she couldn't afford to move forces south, else Rakote would be unraw-doggable, firmly setting her empire on the path to ruin. Instead, the bold queen decided on a course of action most would deem ill-advised. All forces would focus on taking the Egyptian capital as quickly as possible. As for the south, well, if you ignored the problem, it's like it wasn't even there. Surprisingly, that wouldn't be the only leader Amenetor would meet, as Suleiman would make his entrance with Christian sex boys in tow. And what was surprising was his white flag and 0 yields per turn. In fact, unlike the others, Suleiman didn't come to make war with Nubia. Instead, he had a proposition. You see, Suleiman was an important sultan from a faraway land and had come to seek refuge after losing the Ottoman fratricide struggle, something Amenetor was all too willing to acquiesce to, even though the question still remained: why would this foreign leader help us, the nation at war with the entire world? The question would have to be answered later, as Nubian forces had finally surrounded the city, capturing the settler in the process. Which is when the army realized the city wasn't under siege. This complicates matters significantly, as the tiny army was on the clock with Cleopatra mere turns away from her first chariot archer. And with the southern border less protected than a Trump rally, that same melanated challenger was now gaining in the polls. But Amenetor was a crafty queen, and wasn't about to let anyone take her dreams away, especially not when she still had an ace up her sleeve. She orders the only melee unit in the army to assault the city. This weakens the unit significantly, meaning if Cleo obtained her walls or chariots next turn, the warrior's chances of survival would only best a Minotaur's chances at seeing the stars, and as they impatiently wait for a response, nothing ever happens. But they weren't out of the woods just yet, as it was all up to the weakened warrior. Were they strong enough to take the city? Wait a minute, why does he have wicks? No matter, the battle was turning against them as only a single warrior was left standing on our side. An Officer Kodak with nothing but an oversized club in hand and methamphetamines running in his bloodstream managed to clutch the 1v2 and single-handedly raw dog get it. With this decisive victory, a Minotaur was given room to breathe. She'd done it, ensuring the continued survival of her people for a few more years, if nothing else. Not only did the new city and settler increase her manufacturing capacity threefold, the prisoners of war set about an intimate relationship with the nation's infrastructure until death do them part. But the city of Rakote was more than a mere resource colony. It had perfect geographic positioning. The Sinai was a natural choke point, able to funnel armies single file that the now famed Nubian archers would be able to take out one by one, making the city a frontier fortress. Along with the Sahara to the west, the only front a Minotaur and her two new allies had to focus on was the south, much to the chagrin of Trump's presidential campaign. And the timing couldn't have been better, as Menelik had just sent the vanguard of his invasion force. But while Nubia was repositioning forces, their situation was made more precarious after meeting Arabia and the Congo. Now facing pressure from the northwest and south, it was evident that this situation was unsustainable. They needed to enact a permanent solution to bring peace and prosperity to the continent. Okay, for what we're about to do, the first one actually kind of worked. And so a Minotaur and the council came up with a bold plan. The Nubian army would accomplish what no man has ever done, but what no black man has ever done before, and march their army south until they conquered all of Africa. All that would have to be defended then was a long coastline, and the suffocating Sinai, which would be sustainable enough to allow them to focus on more technological pursuits. However, there was a slight oversight to their plan. The other nations of Africa were never just going to bend the knee and claim fealty to a new queen, and the first of those prideful nations was the Empire of Ethiopia, led by Menelik, the King of Kings. The crusade won't be easy, with mountains on all sides evening out to steep hills on the edges. The Ethiopian heartland was as rugged as their army was powerful. Every man that crossed those mountains knew that this was an all-or-nothing gamble. And like any gamble, they would either achieve the financial freedom to sample every flavor of Colombia's finest known to man, or the wife's next tax return will proudly display her parents' residence. To tip the balance in their favor, Minotaur has finally released her secret weapon. Archery would share the secrets of the Patati to the masses, allowing an uptick in involuntary conscriptable populace available for this elite archer corps. But more important than their power was their mobility. After getting a taste of some financial freedom and the subsequent 3 move speed it provides, the Nubian forces were able to blitz past the choke point before Menelik could be informed of the startling news, only finding out when arrows began flying towards his residential palace. Unfortunately, Nubia couldn't bring their entire firepower to bear because of the siege on all fronts. Units had to be left behind to ensure stability. However, in contrast to the Egyptian campaign, this reduction in firepower wasn't going to stop the Nubians from using their primitive form of napalm to drone strike those farmers. And with Menelik's misplaced faith that the mountains would protect them, construction on defenses hadn't even been planned. The only hope Ethiopia had was their sizable army, if it actually shows up. Minotaur herself couldn't believe the lack of Ethiopian forces, and so questions began to float around in her admittedly larger than average head. Do they not care about their capital? We'll get into that later because the scouts have finally made their report. It was now the Ethiopians' turn to counterattack. moving in their forces to intercept the archers raining fire on their capital, but would they make it in time? Well, truth be told, it turns out that settling a city away from any source of water is as stupid as it sounds, and without a large population to man the walls, Addis Ababa overtook Chicago as the #1 exporter of black-on-black crime. Menelik had to act now, and act he did, with speed and force not seen in this mortal world since Amenetor swore off water slides. The King of Kings and his army poured through on all sides, pitting the smaller Nubian army against the mountains and the sea. This was it. They either win now or get canied, ruining any chances they have of making it to space. The archers could no longer afford to attack the city with the hordes closing in. Kodak and his army had to take it now, or else Ethiopia's beefed-up warriors would eviscerate the best archers Nubia had to offer. And after leading his forces into the city, he does it again, leaving the archers free to make the Ethiopian army question why no one informed them of the coming solar eclipse, which occurred that day. Despite their success, something was bothering Amenetor. Menelik knew about the role her archers had in the conquest of Egypt, so why didn't he prepare his own? Well, as she would soon find, the honest answer was that he couldn't. And the plague that had benefited Amenetor up to this point would soon prove to be her undoing. Addis Ababa has no water source, and as a consequence, the gene diversity of a redneck town in rural Alabama. The issue with such a low population that played Russian roulette with health defects every time they got it on was that Amenetor had 7 turns to eliminate the other 2 Ethiopian cities, and if she failed, then the rebels would emerge from the mountains and completely surround her army. Thankfully, the city of Mekelle was nearby, and after leaving a garrison to aggressively beat down the rebels, Amenetor had a few more turns to work with as the siege of Mekelle had begun. But then the siege dragged on, and on, and on. It was simply too strong, and with only so many civilians you could collectively punish before it loses its shock value, time was running out and reinforcements were needed, which led to the bold Amenetor deciding that she needed to take another risk. The Patati garrison was sent in to assist the siege, succeeding in moving the needle far enough along to begin breaking the defenders. But without the Black Gestapo back home, Ethiopians were starting to get dangerous ideas of freedom, self-determination, and keeping it in the family. Leading us to this very moment, Nubia has to take the city right here, because if not, they were one Miro flood from Addis Ababa, feeling comfortable enough to launch their own audible love revolution. And Kodak, who had come through time and time again, had finally run out of luck. All that was left for Amenetor was to grit her teeth and pray that the city would hold for just one more turn. Shut up, this is serious. Serious enough for our brave secret police to lock in and make Crystal Knot look like wealth redistribution, taking Mekelle the next turn and swinging the loyalty balance against Ethiopia, leaving just the city of Dear Diary before complete dominance of the Ethiopian highlands could be achieved. And after their hastily mobilized recruits were given a Gaddafi dilation by our experienced war criminals, there was nothing between Nubia and Deir Dawa. But just as the city was about to fall, Amenetor's entourage caught wind of a troubling development. A resistance group had organized due north, while a scouting party from a different camp was discovered. If that scout gets back to its encampment, it will trigger a flood of rebels that will descend upon Nubia with a ferocious appetite that won't be satiated until Nubia lay a burning ruin. They would need a sizable force to stop that disaster. The force currently besieging Deir Dawa. The city had to fall, or the Nubian army would die trying. Although dying isn't something these veteran forces are too familiar with, as the King of Kings was now left without a kingdom. The subsequent conflict with the native people ended in disaster for the natives. Eloquently put to words by this Batati poet after the war, "The third leg was my brush, and their rims were my canvas." P. Diddler. However, Amenetor could not afford to rest as Dido had begun launching raids into the northern provinces. This development left the Nubian queen in a conundrum. Does Kodak take the forces north to refortify the Sinai, giving time for the enemy to construct fortifications our coked up war criminals couldn't hope to penetrate? That question was the deciding argument that sealed victory for the Strike South Doctrine's plans, as the domestic population was left to deal with the pillagers, as there was still an entire continent left to conquer, and Mvemba controls the most fertile parts of said continent, because whoever controlled the jungles of Africa and its vast riches would control Africa itself. But did Nubia have the firepower to tame that jungle? Earlier in time, you could respond with a resounding yes, but as you and Amenator undoubtedly know, the march of progress stops for no one, and these elite archers are no exception. Fortunately, there was one promotion that would ease the strain of fathered time and make this conquest possible, since as of now, with all this rough terrain, guerrilla fighters were undoubtedly waiting to pounce on Nubia's desert forces. But malaria be damned, the treacherous jungle would bow to the Queen of the Nile in time. And as her forces moved in, Amenator was surprised to find that only limited Congo skirmishes were launched, at least until they reached the first main settlement. Congo was stronger than anything Ethiopia or Egypt had to offer, and after seeing the spearmen leading the garrison, the reason why was obvious. The AI was evolving technologically. While rough terrain normally means a defensive advantage, the archers were closing in on elite status, and all the defensive advantages in the world wouldn't be enough to protect the Congolese from 2 attacks in one turn. But it's not all good news. These new units were now irreplaceable. Any replacements couldn't hope to match their veterancy before they became obsolete. And just because they could attack twice doesn't mean that the city would now melt. With 27 combat strength, if they could last long enough to construct walls, then the elite archers would be left more vulnerable than pre-teen feet at a Dan Schneider production. Fortunately, a member of the entourage had a plan.
Are you sure this will work?
Well, I know I wouldn't be able to resist.
Holy shit, it's a young Christian twink. Quick, everybody ditch your positions.
However, despite the plan working to perfection, it turned out that not everybody fell for the irresistible trap. Yes, that was a double entendre. The city was now stronger than before, and as you've no doubt inferred from those damage numbers, the counter to the Patati Archer had just made its appearance. The strongest resource-free unit in the classical era would make mincemeat of any of Amenator's archers. Thankfully, the city was at half health, and with everything her veteran forces had been through, the title Superstar would be underselling their skills, as the fall of Congo would no doubt prove. Despite that, the noose of loyalty had once again begun to hang around Amenator's neck. That's quite the wide knot, as in this moment of triumph, unbeknownst to the army in attendance, the true difficulty of the game was about to reveal itself. While facing the Congo from the south, barb camps began to arise in the middle of Nubian territory. Raids from Phoenicia became ever more daring, and the siege from every front had begun to take its toll. Luxuries were pillaged, amenities non-existent, and the people fed up with their daily rations of the only foodstuffs left in abundance. Arby's hamburgers. And just as the situation was looking untenable, something that could only be considered a direct intervention from God happened. A golden age dawned upon the Nubian civilization. This newfound patriotic fervor meant that even the newly conquered Kwangao was singing God Bless the Whale in perfect Nubianese. And the removal of the time limit may have just been what saved her dream. Because it turns out, the Congolese capital was an impossible city to take, with no more than 2 areas you could attack from. Even with 2 double attack archers dealing significant damage, it would never be enough. He will obtain walls before the city falls, which would spell the end of Nubia's African ambitions. Their only hope was to somehow flank the city with a double attack archer. If not, then this entire game was about to become a lot harder. But the issue is that the only available archer has half health. One hit and death would no doubt wink its anus at the beleaguered veteran. Thankfully, he's able to squeeze in and avoid the chariot until his kryptonite sprung the trap. Despite this quagmire, the archer possessed first hitter's advantage, and so the war veteran stared down certain death with a defiant glare in his eye, and only pissed himself a little, before dealing significant damage to the unit. But would that be enough to prevent the cornered unit's demise? If not, then Nubia would be forced to disengage from the siege, heads hung low in defeat. And as the chariot barreled in, just as it looked like the unit would shatter, He stands strong, proceeding to eliminate the chariot the next turn before flanking the city, and before too long, Mbanzo Congo agreed to unconditionally surrender. Despite the still sporadic resistance, any threat to her rule was swiftly mopped up by Amenetor's death squad, which would turn out to be the least of her troubles in this upcoming age of darkness. Starting with Mali, finally crossing the Sahara and opening up another front from across the Yellow Sea, while the barbarians and other civilizations were amping up the pressure on all frontiers. But it was nowhere near as much as they could and soon would be able to inflict, influencing Amenetor to continue forward as the tip of Africa was within her grasp. All she needed to do was take out just one more competitor before the South was pacified forever, and standing in her way was one of the strongest militaristic leaders in the world, the Zulu, a powerful opponent to— Wait, what's that?